Welcome to the Aftermath of Sexual Trauma. I'm Shantae Dent. Today's episode is all about marriage and intimacy. Some survivors of sexual trauma may not understand initially, they may not understand how being sexually violated can affect your marriage and your intimacy with your spouse. It didn't hit me until my wedding day. I didn't anticipate a lot of the triggers until after I was married. I believe it's important to talk about triggers when you're married after being sexually violated, because if you don't, these subjects and these issues, they become the elephant in the room, and marriages can be destroyed if we don't give attention to these areas that we may feel a little uncomfortable talking about at times. At the same time, it's extremely important. It is essential when it comes to that healing process. A lot of times when we take the time to begin this healing journey, we are thinking about ourselves, which is normal, it's natural. What am I going through? How is this affecting me? And again, when you're married or if you have children, you realize it's affecting my relationships, it's affecting my marriage. And so if you read my book, My Lemonade Recipe, Turning Life's Sour Experiences into Something Sweet, you will recall my personal experience of being happy, full of joy. Who wouldn't be when you are getting married to someone you love and you have this wonderful relationship with? But again, I didn't count the cost. I didn't have a full understanding of how healing from sexual violation would affect marriage and intimacy. I remember having moments of not understanding, like, how do I communicate to my husband, like, what I'm feeling or why I'm feeling this way? There were times where I couldn't really pinpoint the root cause, and again, at the end of the day, it wasn't always comfortable having to say, oh, I am struggling in this area because of my past violations. Like, I don't want to own that right away. But thankfully, I didn't waste too much time before I spoke with a rape crisis counselor who helped me along the way. I spoke to my mother. She helped me along the way as well. And it got to the point where I realized I did have to talk to my husband, and it was important for me to communicate with him how I was feeling, and that we would together as a team and as a couple just work through that process. I mentioned in my book as well that my husband was an anchor for me during that healing process. He helped me overcome obstacles and various triggers, and that was very helpful because it showed that he was in it. He had this love for me, and he wanted to see me win, and he wanted to see me overcome just as much as I wanted to see that in my own life. It is important for couples to communicate for a number of reasons. There will be times where the spouse, and I say spouse because it could be the husband who is the survivor of sexual violation, and there'll be times where the spouse can take it personal. If you're being triggered during intimacy or triggered during a conversation, and the survivor, may lose it, and that could easily come across as, rejection to your spouse. And instead of sugarcoating the issue or ignoring the issue, it is important to communicate as a survivor, this is what I'm going through, this is what I feel. And for that spouse to have an open heart and an open mind to listen to whatever the survivor is expressing, respect what the survivor is expressing, and again, as a team and as a couple, that both individuals are working toward getting better. So for some survivors, and I do get this, and I also feel that you can overcome. this arena. But there are some survivors who are stuck. This is what happened to me. This is how I respond, period. And they don't allow room for growth. They don't allow room for recovery. And that isn't healthy. And again, I'm not going to sugarcoat and make it seem as if it's extremely easy to work through the triggers. I will say it is important to give them attention and to be intentional, create a plan. This is my trigger. These are my triggers. What am I going to do to work through them? How do I get to that point to where they no longer control me or control my behavior, but I'm able to identify and acknowledge, and then again create a plan on how am I going to work through this trigger? What am I going to do? What's my next step? And because the goal is that marriages and relationships are not ruined because of the aftermath of sexual trauma. Now, today's episode is different because I'm not doing this alone. I have invited my wonderful husband, and I am so honored and thankful that he agreed to join me today. And I didn't say it at the beginning. I wanted to just throw some information out there first and then open this door and introduce to you all my amazing husband, Howard. Babe, thank you for joining me. You already know how much I appreciate you, and I don't take that for granted, so I make sure I'm telling you often how valuable you are to me, not just then, but even now, supporting what I do and how I do it. I'm very appreciative. But I wanted you to join me today because I wanted someone, again, maybe a husband or even a wife, someone to hear your heart or your thoughts in terms of supporting me through the trauma, through the triggers, or even what was it like for you? What were your thoughts like? And again, I already mentioned in my book, he was so supportive, but it's nothing like hearing from the actual individual. So Howard, the floor is yours. I would like you, I guess, to share with the audience, what was your mindset in terms of supporting me during some of the triggers in our marriage?
Well, I certainly, at least at that time, thought I went in with my eyes wide open. When we got married, of course, all of that was known to me, and I was prepared to support you in any way that I could, to the extent that I knew how, and perhaps there was some deficiency on that part. And so I went in with my eyes wide open. As we got married, started living our life as husband and wife, doing what husbands and wives do. and there were times where you were triggered, where that, and I think I somewhat discounted or underestimated the impact or the effect that would have on me. Part of my mindset up to that point, really has been that, so whatever, the world, the life throws at me, I can handle it. There's things that I can do to control the situation, to rectify the situation, to solve problems. Good, bad, or somewhere in between, but unfortunately that's how a lot of people think, and that's how a lot of men think. Facing this situation, this was something that I could not solve. This is something where it wasn't in my hands to be able to solve that problem. And that it did bother me. It felt as if there were, as a husband, you want to do all that you can to make sure your wife, your family, are protected, are supported, and all those things that you vow to do once you're married. And it felt, at least initially, that I couldn't do that when it came to protecting you from something that did happen. I know that sounds strange, but I felt that I could not do that, or I did not know how to do that. And and those times, again, going back to the idea you talked about intimacy, where you were triggered. I guess the question is, well, how did that make me feel? It did make me feel good. To know that you were doing something or engaging in something that should have been enjoyable between a man and a wife, and it somehow, some way caused pain. Yeah. And whether intentional or not, well, certainly it wasn't intentional, but that you were somehow either the source or the contributing factor to that pain. It hurt. It made me saying, well, if that's going to cause pain, mental, emotional pain, I love her that much that I don't want to cause her that pain. So how do I handle that? And there's nothing like, again, being put in a situation where after again, yourself and me and Shantae, engaged in those things that men and wife do as being married, and tears are shed.
Yeah.
It hurt me as a husband, and what hurt was that, again, and intellectually I understood it, but again, emotionally and mentally, it was, again, in my mind, am I doing something that's causing her pain? To relive some event, what is she thinking about me? What should I be doing differently? How can I fix this? And there wasn't really anything that I could do to fix it, but not engage in that activity, which is not something you want to do, yeah. Especially being newly married. So that was certainly a struggle for me. In fact, it's even a struggle for me to even talk about it right now. It's and now we've come a long way over these. What will it be? 14 years this year?
15?
I think it's 14.
Let's do that.
No, it'll be 15 in December,
yes,
right? Yeah,
I was right.
Yeah, 2006. But and as time, they say time heals all wounds. There's some truth to that, but there are also times where something could happen, and I got to a point where perhaps I thought, oh wow, that's sort of in the rearview mirror, but something happens and it's not. And sort of those thoughts continue to flood sort of back into my head, and okay, what am I doing? What did I do to cause this? And is it, again, you're not the cause of it, but you're the immediate trigger, or I was the immediate trigger. And again, that as a husband, that did not make me feel good. And what was also difficult about it is that, again, the idea that if a problem arises throughout my life, if something happens, I could fix it, I could control it, I can come up with a solution, or remove myself from that situation. I always told myself I have those options. I didn't have those options now. Certainly wasn't going to remove myself from the situation.
Please don't.
And there was nothing that I could do other than just being there and listening and trying to understand. And sometimes I couldn't understand. Yeah. And so that was layered on top of some of the frustration I had as well. Now, over time, again, time does have a medicinal effect on a lot of things that we experience as humans, And that was the case in this situation as well. I think the thing that Shantae did was that she was not afraid to address it, to approach it, perhaps make me talk about it when I really don't, didn't want to talk about it. And, and I think that went a long way in helping me to realize that this is not something that I could fix, and it's not something, and being okay with the idea that I couldn't fix it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that, and I'm just amazed too because number one, it's, as Howard already said, it's not easy, just being open about, this level of intimacy in your marriage. But at the same time, we both understand the importance of it because we know there are many couples out there who are struggling in this area. And as Howard mentioned, we saw the signs early on in our marriage. It didn't take long at all for us to realize this was being intimate was a huge trigger for me. And Howard, you mentioned something that is profound. You said it was like unintentional, but you felt like you were the person causing this harm. And on the flip side, as the survivor, I just remember always wanting to, have you remain confident in the fact that it's not you, like it's not your fault that I'm feeling this way. And I just remember you kind of like wondering, how could it not be my fault? If we weren't engaging in intimacy, then you wouldn't be triggered on that level. And it seemed very complex because the root of the issue was I was raped. I was sexually violated. You weren't there. You had nothing to do with it. But again, here's that word, but the aftermath, after the fact, there are components that can cause that survivor to feel like they're living through that trauma all over again. And so again, it was difficult to separate the two. And in terms of just, as Howard said, communicating almost like I'm like, nope, we have to talk about it. I don't like it, but we have to talk about it. And it wasn't easy for me to address it, but I realized my why. Why would I want to even have this conversation with my husband? Well, I realized because if I don't, our marriage may not last, right? And if it does, it won't be as whole and complete as it could or should be. It won't be as healthy as it should be because of this component of intimacy. Like it's fragmented, it's fragile, it's damaged. And I knew that it was important to talk about what I was feeling, why I was feeling it, and, ways that he could support me. And this is what I want to transition to now, ways that a spouse can support a survivor. You made another powerful statement, Howard, about knowing that this wasn't something that you could fix, it wasn't something that you could control. And there's a lot of truth to that. As a survivor, like we have to be the ones to make up in our mind that this will not ruin my marriage. It will not ruin my relationship. I'll fight for my freedom. I'm going to do whatever I need to do, therapy, clear communication, one day at a time to ensure that these triggers that manifest during intimacy won't become the norm. And as Howard said, even as time went by, there were still triggers every, now and then, but clearly not as consistent, not as often as they had been when we first got married. But in terms of what spouses can do to support one another. So again, number one, I feel it is extremely important for the survivor to communicate to their spouse, this is what I'm going through, this is why I'm going through it, because we don't want our spouse to feel rejected. Thankfully for us, Howard knew my story. He was a part of a lot of my healing process. So he was, like he mentioned, he came in eyes wide open. But I cannot imagine a spouse who gets married. You have no idea that you are marrying a survivor of sexual trauma, and this individual is triggered, and the triggers manifest differently for everyone. But this individual is triggered during intimacy, and I can imagine how one could feel rejected. Like, why? A lot of questions, let's just put it that way, could come up, not knowing why you cannot engage in this beautiful, time of intimacy with your spouse. So communicating, survivors, communicate with your spouse and let them know what's going on. Let them inside. And for the spouse, I would say, and Howard, you can also provide insight in this area as well. But one thing that I love to this day is Howard never made me feel guilty about being triggered. He was patient. And let's just be real, physiologically, you're in the heat of a moment. Like, no one wants to really stop, But even in those moments, he would take his time and just be gentle and it's okay. You're safe. Like, these were his words. You're safe. Like, he would just console me. And again, he was patient with me. He wasn't upset with me. Really? Shantae, right now, of all times? Like, he didn't even go there. And you look, he may have been thinking that. But he made sure that I stayed safe. He made sure that I knew I was safe. I knew I was loved. I wasn't being judged. But I was in a safe space to express how I felt. And it gave me hope. Another thing, and I want to pass it back to you, Howard, in a little bit, is when you have couples who are in this position, again, it may not be easy for the non-survivor to understand. For example, you could say, that happened 20 years ago. Why are you still, and you may not use these terms, but why are you still being triggered? And I respond to anyone, if you're not intentionally working toward your healing, again, that could be a form of therapy, a support group, a mentor, reading content and material that will help you in these areas. If you're not being intentional, as Howard mentioned, the phrase, time heals all, and that's not the case with everything. And so when it comes to the sexual assault, the aftermath of sexual trauma, if you're not intentional about healing and recovering, yes, it can be 20 years, it can be 50 years, and there will still be areas that affect you in a major way as a survivor if you have not addressed them, if you've denied them. Here's my term again: denial leads to destruction. And if we're denying that we were assaulted, denying that it is affecting every area in our life, if we're denying that, then it will be impossible to actually, work through that healing process. So I would encourage, couples, the survivor, communicate, the supporter, listen without judging, listen, asking questions is what what can I do? And that is something we also did. However, it seemed a little frustrating initially, like, why do we have to feel so, I guess, elementary in this arena of intimacy? But that's something that we had to do. Everyone is different, but it might be step by step, line by line. What works for you? What's comfortable for you? What's uncomfortable for you? And the answers to those questions may change over time, but there may be, for example, just certain positions, let's just say that may not work for a survivor due to their history. That's okay. So supporter, if that's the case, be patient, be respectful. And again, that may change over time. But I tell you one thing, when a survivor feels safe, respected, and trusted, that's when the game can change a lot easier. But if they feel there's some tension and discord, disrespect, it's a lot easier for the walls to come up and to cease any potential progress. Howard, as we wind this up, what would you share? And I'll say, to a husband because you're a husband, but really to any spouse who may be in this position and they're struggling and this is new to them. They may be newly married or they've been married for years and they've never addressed this concern. What advice, suggestions, or even like encouragement, like hope, hold on, it'll get better. Like, what would you share?
I will say don't deny it, don't ignore it, and don't get frustrated, and don't assume that this is as good as it gets. Um, and part of that too is I think the view on marriage. If you have a view of marriage that it is forever, as long as you and your wife are alive here on this earth, then this is just a very short, ideally, hopefully, a very short period of time throughout, what will be many, many years together. Um, don't, a tendency. I think something that initially crept sort of into my psyche was that the idea that, and this is part of not just men, but people's ego, right? If you don't understand something, you have a tendency not to be empathetic. If you can't understand it, I want everyone to think. Don't we all? We want everyone to think the way that we do, and that's just it's apparent throughout the history of the world. So many things happen because we want people to think the way that we think. When you take that down to a micro level, you don't understand what happened. You don't understand how your wife feels. You don't understand what it means to be a victim of sexual assault. You say, just get over it. That's done. It's in the past. And if that's your frame of thought, then you lose the ability and the capacity, I think, to be empathetic, to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and that causes frustration. And that frustration leads to many other things, which may not manifest themselves in the bedroom. Maybe you're sympathetic there, but in other parts of your marriage, perhaps it does. So I say again, don't deny it's happening. Don't ignore that it's happening. Don't let your lack of understanding of what's happening get in the way of you empathizing and sympathizing with your wife or your husband in terms of what is happening. And look through where you are now. Decide where you want to be, where you all want to go, and what's the best route to be there. And 9 times out of 10, it's a matter of communicating within the marriage, and if you need to, bringing someone else in. As a counselor, that is, bringing someone else in to help you guys walk through that. Because oftentimes, if you're take a parent-child relationship, when your child tells you something, like that's your child, you should change their diaper, you're prone probably at least, up to a certain age, not to take them at their word in terms of they know what they're talking about. When you talk to another parent, another teenager, like, oh, wow, that's how my child is feeling. It really opens you up, where it's not just how you feel, how you think, versus how the other person feels, how the other person thinks. So bringing in that different perspective will help, I think, have a better understanding, be more empathetic, and saying, wow, my point of view is not the only point of view. Think about it from her point of view, his point of view. What can I do to sort of bridge the two?
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that information and suggestions, which I wholeheartedly believe will be so helpful and a turning point for many couples. You nailed it when you said sometimes it may not be as easy to just talk amongst and work through it just, one-on-one. And you may need to bring someone else in, to help and navigate this conversation or serve as a mediator and a counselor. And one thing I would say when it comes to counseling is just ensure that you're being transparent. If you do have any counseling sessions, I love therapists. They're obviously key to helping many individuals process pain and other types of issues that they experience. And I also believe that, if you're going to go to the therapist, don't waste your time or their time. Go there ready to be open, honest, and transparent about what's really going on so that you can see the results and enjoy that fruitful life or that fruitful marriage. Howard, I thank you so much for being a part of today's episode. I feel like it's important when you are talking about marriage and intimacy that you have both parties involved if you can, so they can hear from different perspectives. So I do appreciate you being transparent, honest, and even vulnerable to share about your experience in our marriage, especially during the early times when the triggers were a lot, more consistent. And so, again, if you're out there and you are just identifying with the subject matter today, I would hope that after you listen, that you and your spouse will take that time to have an in-depth conversation about where you are right now, and as Howard mentioned, where you want to go and how you're going to get there. Create a plan, whatever it looks like for you. Make it unique, make it special for you and your spouse so that you can enjoy everything in every area of your marriage. And 15 years strong, and I'm so grateful that we vowed to communicate with one another. We have vowed to respect one another, to compromise in some areas, and we can confidently look at our marriage and share with you all that it does get better. It can get better. Our intimacy is a lot better, and it's because we made a decision. We were intentional. Both of us were intentional to create a plan and to communicate and to respect so that we could enjoy intimacy and enjoy every area of our marriage. Thank you, babe.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining today's episode of The Aftermath of Sexual Trauma. As I mentioned earlier, it was such an honor to have my husband join on this episode. Now, if you're not following me on social media, you got to make sure you do that. Mrs. Shante Dent, MRSCHANTEDENT. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and you can catch every episode there. You can also find me on YouTube at Shante Dent. My website is shantedent.com. Stay connected. I'm constantly providing content that will help you heal emotionally, love earnestly, and live freely from the aftermath of sexual trauma.